Hello, my name is Mark Noble, and I'm Senior Vice President of ETF Strategy at Horizons Exchange Traded Funds. And welcome to today's webinar on the Horizons Industry 4.0 Index ETF. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in our webinar today. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions on today's webinar. Now, keep in mind that this is actually a recorded webinar. I wish I could be there with you in person, but we do go out of our way to address all questions within 24 hours of receiving them. In addition, you'll notice there's a number of handouts with today's webinar. There's a presentation, a product lineup, and product sheet, and actually a very interesting backgrounder on this particular ETF, all of which are available for download in the handout panel of your control panel. So you may download this anytime during the presentation. Please note this call is recorded, so you are free to listen to the content anytime, and it will also be available on our website at www.horizonsetfs.com-ETF-4. So let's get going. Industry 4.0. This ETF falls in what we would refer to as our thematic bucket at Horizons ETFs. We have a number of benchmark ETFs and have increasingly started to launch ETFs that look at what are sort of global thematic investment ideas. And when we talk about themes, we're talking about an idea or investing in a philosophy. And it's a growing space in the ETF industry because people are starting to look at just beyond sectors and industries and trying to really gravitate towards ideas. So in today's case, what we're looking at is the Industry 4.0. And I'm going to talk about what Industry 4.0 is and why it's the next age of disruption, as well as talk about obviously the ETF that we offer and how it gets exposure, some of the key technologies, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty on the actual index details of how this is composed. So what is Industry 4.0, or as people often refer to it as the fourth industrial revolution? If we go throughout history, particularly at the beginning of the industrial age, which is now getting pretty long in the tooth, over 300 years roughly, we start to ask ourselves, how important is technology when it comes to driving economic and social change forward? And I think a lot of people, understand that technology is obviously important, but sometimes they forget just how important it is in actually driving forward change. So if we go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution that people tend to think of when they think of Charles Dickens novels and Victorian England and steamships, we're talking about really the early adoption of mechanization, which came about with steam power and the weaving loom. And this came about in the late 1700s and really took off in the mid 1800s and mid 19th century. And you have to understand that up until this point in time, the vast majority of people in the world had some sort of rural, probably agricultural focused setting, probably well over 99% of the global population. So the period of between 1784 and the 20th century was probably the greatest period of upheaval, both socially and technologically, in human history, as these advancements in technology allowed for specialization of labor and allowed for the beginnings of important things such as manufacturing, industrial output, goods, and as well with steamships, the idea of global trade. In fact, if we look at countries like the United States, for example, and a lot of people aren't aware that the single biggest driver of the United States economic growth in its early period was textiles, right? The United States was the world's textile leader for a number of years in the early 19th century, and that was brought by the weaving loom and the cotton industry, and of course we had the Civil War that resulted part of the issues with that. So these kind of technology changes, they have a huge impact on how we live. And as I mentioned, they create obviously economic investment opportunities. Now we move to Industry 2.0. With Industry 2.0, we're moving to really the idea of mass production and the assembly line. Of course, between 1870 and 1970, we had two major world wars, which obviously created their own type of upheaval. But through this period, we also had the invention, this massive invention of electricity. And electricity allowed for true automation, allowed for the idea that, things like people working at night, factories running without humans having to be doing all of the power in them. These are really disruptive in their own form as well. In the 1870s to the 1900s, early 20th century, we had the invention of the railroad and the interconnectedness of things like North America and Europe through the railroad. And we had the beginning of mass production. So when we talk about people like Henry Ford, for example, obviously his assembly line innovations to build Ford Model Ts were very crucial, but there was a social aspect to that as well, in that we had the creation of cars that weren't just being bought by the wealthy, but cars that were being bought by everybody. So Industry 2.0 really brought out what we would call today the middle class of America, allowing for this upward mobility and lifestyle enhancement in the Western world that came about from workers also becoming consumers. Now, Industry 3.0 very simply was sparked by really the advent of what we would call modern electronics and computer processors. So we think about things like the PC revolution of the 1980s, the personal computer revolution of the 1980s, the development of the internet, wireless technologies. This was all occurring between 1970 and sort of 2010. So what is Industry 4.0? Well, Industry 3.0 and Industry 4.0 are, when these changes happen, it's not like a flip goes off and says, oh, we're no longer Industry 3.0, we're now Industry 4.0. In fact, these changes occur, over time as you sort of blend from one industry to another. And what's happening in Industry 4.0 is all of the data created by creating the internet, creating the digital world, is now being merged with a physical world. So the thing about Industry 3.0 is Industry 3.0, it made us interconnected globally, right? In fact, you don't have to travel to East Asia to do business there. A lot of that can be done for things like teleconferencing, using internet, email. That, in itself was a massive leap forward in terms of economic progress, but it's still a digital world, right? The internet exists apart from us. When we talk about Industry 4.0, what we're talking about is taking all of the data and our centers of data and our ability to store data and merging smart electronics and semiconductors and processors with everything else in the world, their physical world. So it's the merging of the physical and the digital. And this is where you end up with things like robotics, smartphones, self-driving cars, drones. So all of this really kind of science fiction kind of technology, it's made possible by the massive leap forward in software and intelligence of the data being used. And so in our view, this is a massive mega trend, probably, the next big age of disruption. And for most people listening today, we were going to probably live through two. We lived through the 1970s, 1980s computer and internet disruption going into the late 1990s. And now we're going through this next era of digital integration of most physical inanimate objects and other types of technologies. So it's a big, big theme. Now, obviously, today we're talking about how do we capture this theme? How do we invest in this growing change that's occurring? And it's occurring right now, and it's happening very quickly. If you think about things like cell phones, for example, smartphones, we go back to 2006, which was only 12 years ago. We didn't have the iPhone. We didn't have, we had early iterations of the BlackBerry, but we'll warp forward in mobile technology that shows us how quickly these technologies can catch on, to the point now I think most people in the Western world and increasingly the emerging world would argue that their smartphone is an essential tool with how they interact with everything, whether it's messaging or apps that run their security systems or fitness. So all of these ideas come together very quickly. And so we're living through this disruption right now. And there's really key technologies that are at the forefront of this merging of the digital with the physical. So we have cloud and big data. Data is obviously extremely important because the more data that is integrated into things, the smarter they can be. Blockchain technology, we won't belabor that too much today, but we have the idea of disintermediated transfer of accounting and transactions. Robotics is obviously a huge topic, and of course, when we talk about advanced robotics, we're also talking about what powers advanced robotics on the intelligence end, which is artificial intelligence, augmented reality and 3D printing, cybersecurity to protect all that data, and the named Internet of Things. And the Internet of Things is talking very much about the inanimate objects or appliances being enhanced through the use of data and internet technology. So all of these kind of T technologies are underpinning Industry 4.0. And typically what we've seen happen over the last 4 or 5 years is a lot of investors have gravitated towards each of these technologies individually, trying to figure out which one is the next great technological advancement. And what we're kind of trying to say here today is that actually a lot of these technologies all are sort of driving towards this same idea of Industry 4.0. In fact, I would argue that all of these technologies don't exist in isolation. They're all working together towards this ultimate goal of integrating the digital with the physical. So our idea was to put all of these key ideas, all these key industries together in one ETF that gives you a one-ticket solution to invest in this thematic idea, this trend that we expect to be potentially huge over the next 20 years. So the ETF is the Horizons Industry 4.0 Index ETF with the ticker symbol 4. Fairly straightforward in that regard. And it is offered on the Toronto Stock Exchange with a management fee of 65 basis points, which is, we think, very competitive, considering that if you were to try to buy a lot of these global stocks individually, the cost of acquisition through commissions and bid-ask spreads would probably surpass that 0.65% management fee. So we're trying to give you this ability to have this one-ticket solution to invest in this area. And it's an index tracking ETF, meaning it tracks a passively managed ETF that tracks an index. And in this case, that is the Solactive Industry 4.0 Index, which is calculated and managed by Solactive AG out of Germany, the 4th largest index provider in the world now. And the Bloomberg ticker index for that index is SOLIN, D4G for any of those who have the benefits of a Bloomberg. So there is back-tested data that you can look at on this index. Now, when we talk about these different Industry 4.0 companies, we're talking about these 5 key areas of industry classification. So I'm just going to quickly highlight these over here. So we have, obviously, as I mentioned, advanced robotics is 1/5 of the portfolio, of the ETF portfolio, Internet of Things, cloud and big data, cybersecurity, and augmented reality and 3D printing. So in this case, the index is comprised of those 5 things, and we're offering you exposure to each of those, each of which is equally weighted. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to quickly talk about what are these technologies, why are they disrupting the world around us, and then how do they all come together in this ETF and index strategy. So the first one we're going to talk about is, the first one we're going to talk about is advanced robotics. Now, robotics is a potentially $1 trillion opportunity, according to Myria Research. This could be, by 2025, represent 14% of growth in global GDP as companies worldwide move towards artificial intelligence and robotics to enhance productivity. And so what's driving this growth is, a lot of, obviously, manufacturing has gotten early. They've moved forward to try to use robotics to improve industrial output. And intuitively, this should sort of make sense. I mean, you have important aspects of robotics, for example, like robotics don't get tired. Robots don't get tired. So you have 24/7 automation of areas. And of course, with the enhancement of integration through Wi-Fi technology or internet hookups, you have the ability to bring more data into robotic systems, which allows them to be smarter and more customized and specialized in the type of things they do. Now, what's really interesting is that we're still fairly early days in this area. So if we look at, and I like to use this example, the industrial aspect of the 1970s to 2000s of Industry 3.0, this was the area where we started to see the development of the early PC area. So this was where Ronald Wayne was selling his $800 his 10% stake in Apple, which would be worth over $100 billion today. And this is where Microsoft was coming to the fore. In the 1980s, we have the development of PC computers. But you can see here that really the most exciting area to be invested was sort of in these early stages. And the companies that were being invested into that time, obviously Apple came back later to be a leader in mobile devices, but Apple, Cisco Systems, Sun Microsystems, Microsoft. These were the companies that were building the digital world and obviously working alongside in industry to really drive things forward in Industry 3.0. And then as we got towards the end of the 2000s, we started to see who were the champions of Industry 3.0, which are the companies from a consumer standpoint, which were able to really take advantage of what had been developed technology-wise to create new consumer giants. So we have Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, Facebook. So those are companies that really are the omnipresent and indeed pretty much largest companies in the world at this point. And they're the ones that were successful in capturing a lot of the growth from this area. So today we find ourselves at this other now flatline infrastructure building of growth. And what we're looking at, obviously on the robotics side, are for the companies that are actually building robots, building technology, to power those robots, such as artificial intelligence. And then as we go forward in the future, we probably find the new Industry 4.0 champions. And I don't have a crystal ball, so I have no idea who those will be, but we know that they're similar to Apple's and Amazon's of their day. They're going to have to rely heavily on the infrastructure of robotics to be built before we start to see those new consumer giants form over time. And so there's a lot of key sectors that robotics and artificial intelligence are going to really come into play here. The big one already out of the gate has been manufacturing. Already 10% of manufacturing functions are automated, and probably we'll see 1 or 4 manufacturing functions automated over the next 10 years. I think, it's already seen massive amounts of industrial output. I've seen studies that have suggested that we've actually dramatically increased industrial output, probably in the vicinity of 10 to 20% over the last decade, whereas there really hasn't been a lot of manufacturing jobs added globally. And that's, again, automation. But we have areas that we probably haven't even considered to the same degree, such as transportation, the idea that 15% of passenger vehicles sold worldwide may be autonomous. And in fact, the technology to do this already exists. This is actually more of a regulatory and consumer issue where people, A, have to be comfortable with self-driving cars, and B, governments have to allow for it. But we could see very quick adoption of self-driving vehicles within the next 10 years. Agriculture, the idea of 24/7 farms that use sensors to improve farming, AI-driven combines. This is all stuff that's happening right now, and it could result in a much bigger yield for agriculture output, so a huge boon for the food industry, but also the companies that are going to be creating agricultural robots could represent about $15 billion in the next 2 to 3 years. Military continues to be a big spender on robotics, with the idea of having, I don't want to call them Terminators, but certainly having self-driving tanks, drones, a lot fewer people being in war zones, and a lot more combat being done by remotely controlled robots and drone systems. Again, it can sound a little bit scary, but from a practical purpose, the idea of having fewer soldiers dying in combat is a big goal for a lot of militaries, not just the U.S. Army, but of course the U.S. Army is pushing this through probably more than any other group globally. And then of course healthcare is probably the most interesting area for me anyways, where you start to see the use of AI in particular in diagnostics really starting to come to the fore. And I have just showing you here, for example, that things like artificial intelligence, 90% diagnostic accuracy rate for lung cancer compared with an average diagnostic accuracy rate of about 50% for human physicians. So we could see a transformative change in healthcare, especially with an elderly growing population of elderly people, where robotics and artificial intelligence take on a much bigger role in helping empower those in the front line of healthcare to do a better job of dealing with patients. Now, the type of technologies that are being developed by robotics, they kind of fit into 4 key areas. We have sensing, actuation, computing, and integration. Sensing is the eyes and ears. Of course, robots don't have eyes and ears, so they need sensors. So companies that are building sensors are key to robotics. Actuation, then again, would be the arms and legs. These are companies actually building robotics that are on assembly lines. And these do interesting things. For example, e-commerce, you tend not to think of e-commerce as being robot intensive, but just think of important things such as having to sort packages and mail them and stamp them with postage stamps. I mean, those kind of work can be done very much quicker using robotics systems, artificial intelligence, and of course, integrating this all together. Now, the type of artificial intelligence that we're talking about with the robotic sector is focused on deep learning. And so obviously types of, well, not obviously, but for a long time, artificial intelligence has been around. There's people studying artificial intelligence for the last, 60, 70 years. But it's really been driven leap forward by what we call the deep neural network learning of the last 10 years. And what that is that's a type of learning where the type of learning process being used by this artificial intelligence is similar to the human learning process. It's a layered experiential process where information comes in and the computer has to sort of figure out what does that mean. Now, the difference here is that this type of deep learning, which is patterned off the human brain, in the past would not have been very successful because you needed a lot of data, right? Just like an intelligent person, they're really only as intelligent as the information that you put in there. In the absence of not having any data or not reading books, you're not really optimizing, the IQ of somebody. Well, it's the same idea here with deep learning in that the type of computers that are being designed now have the ability to access, millions of terabytes of data very, very quickly and look at that simultaneously, and then through that create a decision-making process very similar to what humans do. So it's an autonomous learning process. And our goal here is the hope that AI gets better at, particularly at very information dense processes, such as looking at vast amounts of legal data, market data, healthcare data, and finding patterns and information that would really be beyond the scope of what we can do as humans. So hopefully what we start to see is a lot more of this type of artificial intelligence working alongside human workers and helping empower them to make better decisions as they have access to these very intelligent learning systems that can analyze unfathomable amounts of data. And the AI growth trajectory could be the biggest trend of this larger Industry 4.0 trend, where we have PwC Analytics suggesting that this could be anywhere from a 10 to 15 trillion dollar opportunity within the next 15 years. Now, this comes from not just North America this time. We have to realize this is a real global trend. In fact, a massive amount of the investment in AI is actually being done in East Asia. China in particular now is the second largest direct investor in AI after the United States. And the idea here is to obviously look at labor productivity increasing because robots and AI can work 24/7, but you have other really important improvements to economic output, personalization, with learning more, having more data at your disposal. Obviously, computers and AI get much better at understanding the needs of customers, clients, social issues, because they can look at all of that data and create personalized, customized solutions that are much more tailor-made to the type of data now that's floating around. And I would say that through e-commerce and the internet, the vendors you deal with, whether it's Amazon or the government, even in certain degrees, they know more about you than they have at any point in history because of all the data trail from internet browsing habits, consumer habits, social media profiles. So all that comes into play. In some ways is scary, where people know more about you than they ever have, which leaves you vulnerable. But it also improves the interactions that you have with providers as they get better at customizing and personalizing solutions for you. And then the final piece is quality. There's just going to be certain things that artificial intelligence and robotics might be better at. And I mentioned healthcare diagnostics. It's just the design of those types of machinery to analyze unfathomable amounts of data, again, just makes them better at data intensive projects. So, again, working alongside AI to improve the quality of goods, better quality control in factories, better diagnostics in healthcare, potentially, improve bridge design using 3D printing with AI assistance. These kind of things are real and are happening. And overall, it should improve all of this global economic output by 2030. Now, at the core of AI development is actually semiconductors, which are graphics processing units. So this is just one type of technology that this ETF would invest in, where you're looking at graphics processing units as a core building block. Remember, we're talking about infrastructure of Industry 4.0, and of course, so a company that would be in this portfolio would be NVIDIA, as the world's leading producer of GPUs for gaming and artificial intelligence. And NVIDIA doesn't just make a development for AI. Those AI enhanced vehicles, self-driving cars, such as the ones that are being designed by Uber, Tesla, Volkswagen, Google's Waymo, they all use the NVIDIA chip. So again, regardless of who ultimately starts to harness AI to really get ahead of their competitors, they're probably going to be using companies like NVIDIA to create the technology, or sorry, to be the hardware provider as they go and develop that technology. Same thing with something like sensors, right? Calance is another company that is a sensors company, and you start to see, large amounts of sensor technology being used, and there's other sensor companies there where these are the eyes and ears of that robotics. We also have surgery, right? Robotics being used in surgery, and of course the world's largest provider of that is Intuitive Surgical, which makes the Da Vinci surgical system, which is a remote robotics medical robot. So these are the type of technologies that we see on the robotics side. As we move to the Internet of Things, we start to see a lot more growing use of smartphones, smart appliances, self-driving cars, and of course healthcare systems. When we talk about Internet of Things, we're talking about a network of connected devices and objects that use network-enabled sensors, chips, and processors. And the goal here is that by 2025, there's a real view that about 80 billion devices will be Internet enabled. And we're not just talking about smartphones here. Obviously, that would probably be the largest subcategory here, but we're talking about fridges that tell you what you need for grocery and monitor the health of food. We're self-driving cars. I've even starting smart jackets, wearable fitness applications. So, and here's the other thing about this. This is just projections based on current usage of devices. We don't even know what type of internet connected devices may come to the forefront, right? It may be that everybody has a smart enabled toaster in 10 years. I don't know, but this is where this stuff gets really exciting, because once you enhance the intelligence capability of appliances and household items, we don't know what will catch on from a consumer perspective, and there could be some very interesting applications of items that become smart enabled through internet and data usage. Data and cloud storage. Now, there's been a term out there which I tend to agree with, which is data is the new oil. Now, if we look at what it powered 20th century technology, obviously the need for crude oil and gasoline and the combustible engine was at the forefront of that industrialization. When we're talking about using internet-enabled data-heavy device usage, merging the physical with the digital, well, data becomes your key differentiating factor. The quality of the data you use, the amount of data that can be used, becomes the single most important differentiator in Industry 4.0. And so data is the new oil for Industry 4.0, looking at it from that perspective. And so a lot of the companies that are the big data management firms or commercial cloud storage and data delivery providers, these are absolutely vital infrastructure as we move forward into Industry 4.0, and these include companies like Salesforce, obviously on client relationship management, or even Canada's own OpenText, based out of Waterloo, which does a lot of enterprise data management solutions for large companies. So these are very, very important, because organizing, collecting, and then strategically using data will probably be the key differentiator whether a company is successful in designing Industry 4.0 technologies or whether they fall apart. It'd be similar in the previous past, having cars that run on fewer amount of gasoline or higher quality gasoline would be more important for the trucks that I have, hauling things in industry. And so this is very, very important, and it's probably going to be the key, pipeline of success of Industry 4.0. Now, if our key pipeline, what's going to drive Industry 4.0 is data, we need to protect that. And that's where cybersecurity comes in. So cybersecurity, which has been a very, very attractive sector over the last year, it's actually outperformed broad technology. It's volatile, but as every time that we hear about data breaches, it's pretty much every major organization in the world that's had to contend with some sort of major data breach. We are seeing an increased usage of these very large cybersecurity firms, or even a company like a Booz Allen Hamilton, which focuses primarily on governments and the U.S. government. But these companies are vital, right? Data is going to drive a lot of this growth forward using artificial intelligence and robotics. Then we need to protect that data, and that's where these cybersecurities come in. So 1/5 of the index that we track would be in that. And the global cybersecurity projections, again, are quite large. That's according to Bloomberg Intelligence, where we could see, demand and market size by 2020 being somewhere in the vicinity of 30 to 40 billion dollars for things like specialized threat analysis and IT security. And obviously, mobile will be an increasing area of focus for these companies as more people move to mobile and cloud-based solutions for Internet of Things and the type of devices that they're building. Now, the final one, which is probably the most science fiction-y at this point in time, although AI is pretty cool up there as well, is augmented reality and 3D printing. So when we talk about augmented reality, we're talking about actually, using some sort of visual of where you are now and then having a digital overlay. So, actually the most famous augmented reality software out there is probably Pokemon Go, where wherever you go, the Pokemon will follow. But if you use this and think of this from an industrial standpoint, you can have healthcare technicians, electrical engineers using an overlay over what they're looking at in the real world to really help and assist them to make better decisions. You have sometimes AI assistants within these visual tools where they can do diagnostics and help workers look at things at a more enhanced level, obviously use more data when they look at things. So this could be a very, very interesting growth area over the next few years. You also have real estate, where you take a house and you put your phone up and you can then look at the placement of furniture and colors. That can all be done with augmented reality. 3D printing is using, again, very, very complex calculations, sometimes AI assisted creation of objects through 3D printing. Architecture and industrial design are obviously the two really big areas where this could be transformative. Very small industry relative to the other industries right now, but the projections are quite large, somewhere between 65 to 70 billion dollar range in the next decade, with a good portion of that coming from mobile devices. And that's, again, commercial and consumer use of smartphones being an overlay, being your window into augmented reality. So it'll be a very interesting trend to watch and see how it's used from an application basis by large companies. Now, all this gets put together in our index, and understanding how this index is put together requires just a key understanding of a number of things. Number one, obviously, as I mentioned out of the onset, the index is divided into 5 industry classes, so advanced robotics, internet technology, cloud and big data, cybersecurity, and augmented reality and 3D printing. For all intents and purposes, that means that roughly 1/5 of the ETF is invested in these industries. Then within those industries, the stocks would be market cap weighted. So when I say market cap weighted, it means the largest leaders in those areas would be put into the portfolio, and then there's 10 stocks for each of these industry buckets, and they're equally weighted. Now, in order to even be considered, they need to have a minimum security level market capitalization of at least 200 million, and they need to trade on developed market exchanges, which are in the countries that are all listed here, but that includes Canada, most of Europe, obviously United States, and developed Asia. So when you meet those requirements, then the index is rebalanced quarterly, and each of those stocks within those buckets is provided with the equal weight. So you'd have 50 stocks, and roughly each stock in the portfolio right now has about a 2% weight. Of course, that can change dramatically in between quarterly rebalances as these stocks go up and down, but that's the rebalance weight that you would expect most of the stock holdings to be as it's rebalanced quarterly. Now, some people are probably saying, well, that doesn't seem like a very intelligent way to invest. I want to own the best companies in this area. Well, again, we're focusing on the leaders within those industry buckets. And more importantly, we don't actually know who is going to take a leadership position in Industry 4.0. Industry 4.0 is an idea. It's a thematic idea where we're trying to invest in something we think will happen, but understanding, especially with something rapidly growing like technology, who tomorrow's leaders are is almost impossible. If I go back to 1998, 2000, trying to determine that Palm Pilot would overtake, Apple and vice versa, would be nearly impossible to predict as technology and consumer choice changes. So what we want to do with a strategy like this is provide as broad exposure as possible, recognizing that as companies grow in size and become leaders in these different industries, we're hopefully capturing them through the ETF and therefore providing you that exposure as it goes on. And so these are some of the index constituents in each of these different sectors. I think what's really interesting to highlight on augmented reality and 3D printing is that Baidu and Google, which is Alphabet here, are in there. That's because actually those are probably two of the leaders in development of augmented reality and 3D printing, and probably overwhelm the majority of the other companies there. And it's definitely an area that those two large search providers for Asia and the rest of the world, respectively, are putting money into. When we look at cloud and big data, as I mentioned before, OpenText from Canada, Citrix Systems, Salesforce, SAP, these are the companies, again, that are the pipelines of that very, very important data sources and data management that makes Industry 4.0 essential. And then we have cybersecurity. I mentioned Booz Allen Hamilton. Economy Technologies is in there. They're more of a broader technology companies. There is overlap, right? Something like Economy could also be in cloud and big data. It's really where are they taking a leadership position relative to other companies, how they end up in these buckets. When we look at Internet of Things, we have Nokia, Analog Devices, Maxim Integrated Products. So these companies, again, are taking leadership, usually through semiconductor and hardware development, into integration into Internet of Things. But a company like Red Hat, which was previously bought by IBM in the last couple of weeks, they're obviously a leader in software, Linux, open source development of apps for Internet of Things. And then we have advanced robotics. I mentioned the sensors and the GPUs, so Keyence and NVIDIA. Intuitive Surgical is the large healthcare robot maker. Fanuc is probably the world's largest straight up robotics manufacturer. These are all in that portfolio. Now, the index performance has been somewhat interesting. More speculative growth relative to the NASDAQ 100. Obviously, there's overlap. And when we look at NVIDIA and the Googles, and those are clearly large stocks in the NASDAQ as well. So they are correlated indices. But what I want to highlight here is you do have differentiations of performance. So on a one-year basis, the NASDAQ, as there's been sort of a pullback away from emerging technologies, particularly robotics, which has been very negative relative to the NASDAQ, you've seen a pullback in the Selective Industry 4.0, but over 5 years, similar performance. And what you will see likely is as another growth cycle in technology occurs, you might see our strategy start to really differentiate itself from the Selective Industry from the NASDAQ 100, which is focused on a lot more older technologies, established companies like Microsoft and Apple, whereas ours has much more of a bias towards what we hope are the future leaders of tomorrow. So key reasons to own for: gain diversified exposure to Industry 4.0, potentially the biggest driver of economic growth over the next 2 decades. You'll get exposure to the largest companies in terms of their market capitalization, each of those 5 technology sectors. And remember, tomorrow's leaders may not be today's leaders, but this ETF is designed to hopefully capture that movement. And you're held in equal weight and rebalanced quarterly with a strategy, which creates a buy low, sell high discipline. So every time you're rebalancing, companies that have gone up in value, those returns will be reweighted. Companies that have declined, they'll be increased. And this really provides a discipline to keep kind of moving forward with a buy low, sell high discipline, particularly if this space continues to move forward the way that we hope it would. With that, I'd like to thank you all for being there today. I'm extremely excited about this particular investment space. Now, this is a thematic investment strategy. So, it sort of defies classification on investing in other types of index sectors. And I hope that, when you're looking at your portfolio, if this is an idea that you believe in, that we are at a precipice here where the digital is being merged with the physical, then this is a strategy that tries to capture that for you in one liquid ETF that you can use, one line item for your portfolio to get that exposure. Thanks again, everyone, for being with us today, and look forward to your questions, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon.